Space Center, Houston.
That's good.
We're gonna send this to Jim Riley.
Know what mission these parts were assigned to, if they were assigned.
18, 19, 20 apparently.
Well, 18 is the rocket that's at the Space Center in Florida. That is 18. That was assigned. That's the one Dick Gordon and I would have flown at 17 if it hadn't been canceled. I'm not sure about what part. It'd be either 19 or 20. The rocket that's on display at the Marshall Space Flight Center is a kludge of test articles, as I understand it. But it looks like the real thing and well worth seeing if you're ever down there. That's an excellent museum as well, the Space and Rocket Center. And of course the lunar module was wrapped up, folded up in there, and the command module out here. And what we did was, once you're on through what was called translunar injection, you turned around and docked with the lunar module and pulled it out of its little cocoon, and then later on we deployed the landing gear, and that was really all we had to do to make it operational, other than turn on the battery, turn on the electricity. That I did, I think, on the second day out. I went into the lunar module, made sure the comm was working, that there were nothing had come apart during the launch. The first part of the launch on that first stage down there, you'll see in a moment, was very heavy vibration. It's a kerosene liquid oxygen rocket, and it burned more turbulently than the hydrogen oxygen engines, the J2 engines that were in the next two stages. And that created a lot of vibration up through the stack. And that's one of the main things that you remember, is you can't read any dials because the control and dials and display area in front of you is vibrating like this. And of course, all through training, it was static. And so you were trying to compete with mission control on finding the insidious failures that the simulation supervisor, Sim Soup, was putting into the simulation. Well, you couldn't do that on a real launch. I didn't know that until we actually were going. And at about 2 minutes and 45 seconds, then we staged to the S2 stage. That had the 5 J2s in it, and that was very smooth. No vibration at all. Beautiful engine.
About how high were you at that point?
Good point. I have to go look it up. But we had already gotten rid of the stack, the launch escape tower. So at that point, had we not staged, we would probably have come off and just landed normally with parachutes and so forth.
How's that ejected asymmetrically, so it didn't crash back into you as it came off?
Well, that rocket had as much thrust as Alan Shepard's rocket did. And believe me, it would take that capsule a long way. Just doing it, I mean, it was all taken care of course, by the computers. The actual launch computers section, what was called the IMU section, I think was right in there. Yeah. Surprised it didn't. But that was controlling all. And in fact, that's what really, it didn't pressurize in a normal sequence. Well, the computer didn't know it was pressurized because it was looking to see whether a signal had been sent to pressurize rather than whether it was pressurized. garbage in, garbage out, even in those days. and so we went into this hole for them to fix that, and the way they fixed it was because computers were hardwired. They just put a shunt around that in the computer, around that sensor.
Here's a new resistor here.
and that was taken care of. But it took them time, one, to test it all, to go through simulation, make sure there were no secondary effects, and then most of the time I think was convincing management that they knew what they were doing.
Okay.
You would vary the thrust as a function of that pressure and gain a significant amount of payload. That's just one of a bunch of things that you would do differently. But you know, again, you're talking about what people could do 60 years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And you had to make decisions on how to, because we had a schedule. Kennedy gave us a schedule, and believe me, everybody believed in that schedule.
So it was a kerosene mixture. How did it get enough oxygen into that system to be able to burn?
Oh, it was you had locks.
Okay.
You were pumping oxygen.
You're pumping it.
Liquid.
It wasn't atmosphere.
Oh no, it was kerosene oxygen and then kerosene hydrogen. Now we go down and look at these F1 engines.
Kerosene, a good fossil energy product.
Jack, was that a von Braun design?
No, that was a NASA engineer design at Lewis. I don't think there was a contractor involved in it. And the F1 engine down.
What was so revolutionary about the 75 to make it right?
One was so costly and because you can make methane from the solar wind molecules that are in the carbon and I think we need to dust that, folks. Let's wait for the other. I'll tell you. NASA was formed, and Eisenhower, along with many other things he did to make it easy for Kennedy, he transferred that program into NASA. Also, JPL. He put JPL in NASA. As a contract facility with Caltech. NASA really was built on the management foundation of the NACA, the National Aeronautics Advisory Committee, or Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, and that program, that agency had begun as a research agency in the I think in 1914 for the purpose of transferring airplane technology into the private sector. And they eventually had 3 laboratories: Langley, Ames, and Lewis. And those all became part of NASA. Those are the original NASA. And I guess a test facility at Dryden out in California. And also Eisenhower transferred ordered the transfer of the ballistic missile agency in Huntsville to NASA, which was von Braun, basically. And the Army resisted that for about a year, and finally Ike just said, "Shut up! You know, I'm president, you're not." And so that became the basis for NASA. And at the time, the Kennedy Space Center did not exist. It was a test facility for Huntsville. And then not too long afterward, the Kennedy Space Center was established, and Davis went down to run it. He was deputy for von Braun in Huntsville.
Well, that was Canaveral, right?
That's Canaveral. Yeah, it was at Canaveral. And the Air Force test facility is still there in that area. But and things like that. But the main thing I needed to do was become the best lunar module pilot in the program. So they had no excuse not to fly me. And I think second only to Fred Hayes, probably, I probably knew the lunar module and how to operate it better than anybody. But Fred, well, he lived with the development of the lunar module at Grumman, and I give him credit for knowing a lot more about. Fortunately, it was on Apollo 13 too.
Was the lunar module, was it comparable to flying a helicopter, or how would you?
No, it's not. Again, helicopter flying was mainly just another great experience. It meant that the next experience was going to go more easily. You develop confidence in your ability to do new things. The lunar module was, flew differently than everything. The only comparable similarity with a helicopter is it landed vertical. But even then, you have to, with a helicopter, you see these helicopters in movies and stuff. Most of the time, they're flying in what we call the dead man's curve. That if you lose an engine, you're going to die. Now, you don't normally fly a helicopter that way. You stay out of that curve, and you're always in a position to do a landing, auto rotation or something like that if you lose an engine. And believe me, helicopters are not designed to fly. They fly only because of human control or automatic control. Yes, Scott?
Exactly.
This was 1.5 million pounds.
Is there a horsepower equivalent?
Probably. I'm sure there is.
Right, there is.
Didn't the whole thing go about a swimming pool's worth of fuel every second?
Can't tell you the amount, but there was you probably do the calculation if you want to. 7.5 million pounds thrust burned for 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
I think I've read it's an Olympic swimming pool every
Is
second.
that right? Well, they're probably, and it's those fuel lines that were causing the pogo issues, and they didn't. You didn't have pogo continuously. It just when at a certain fuel depletion, you'd start to get a different set of harmonics.
What would a big commercial jetliner, how many pounds of thrust would one of those burn during takeoff?
Can't tell you.
Air 40s.
How much?
737, 8 or 9, or a 757. Those are 40.
This is
He said it's on the same trajectory.
Is it?
This is
So do we know where they go up?
yeah. LRO has found them all.
Yeah.
So we know where they hit.
We'll try to get another view for
And the lunar module then was inside of it.
We've done that before.
The to replace it. He said, great idea, and so that's what the flag at Apollo 17 Taurus Littrow site that's flying is the original MOCR flag. MOCR stands for Mission Operations Control Center. And so I just want to be sure you understand that. That's an extraordinarily valuable flag. And I worry about him taking care of it. The Capcom console, which you'll probably see in the presentation, was right down here. And flight director was Kranz and Griffin and others sat in the second row from here. And management sat back here, being totally ignored for the most part. From the very beginning of Mercury, Chris Kraft was able to establish the rule is nobody can overrule a flight director. And that was very important discipline to have. Whether the administrator was sitting back there or anything, the flight director was key. And very, very important. The Cy Lieber got, where are we? Yeah, there we are. It was usually sitting right on the first row There'd be one, two, third row over there on the right. And Bill Moon replaced him for our mission, but Cy was there for most of the missions. The docks were back over here. I think media was in the same row as they were, and John Llewellyn and Jerry Bostic and the guidance control guys were down on the front row over there on the left. It's really
And where were you seated?
Well, I was usually at the Capcom tussle. That was my. But I was usually running around chasing issues and problems with all the other young guys.
Did you provide any support or guidance or have any part of the mission during the shuttle program that more or less followed?
I had nothing to do with that. I had left the program by the time shuttle had gone into the Senate. Press on. Also, the plaque that Neil described was also present on all the missions, identical except for Apollo 17. And Apollo 17, we substituted one half of the image of the Earth with an image of the Moon, at my recommendation, I might say, and we put a point on that image of where all the Apollo landings were. Otherwise, it was essentially the same plaque. Any questions from what you've seen here?
Jack, they had to overshoot their landing because of
That also doesn't come through clearly in the film, but Neil, the initial trajectory that they were on was going. Neil noticed would put them on West Crater, what turned out to be called West Crater, a relatively fresh impact crater, and so he paused and overflew that, and that's what generated that low fuel call out.
Yeah, so that when they landed, they had how many seconds of fuel?
Well, the estimate is about 20 seconds. And turns out that's quite a bit for landing. We had 2 minutes on Apollo 17, and I didn't. It seems like it'd be that's awful low fuel, but you're in the process of setting down, and it's really not an issue. But the Apollo 12 lunar module was modified slightly. They only had 4 months to do it, but in putting some baffles in the fuel tanks that improved the fuel gauging. That was the problem. Was the gauges? The fuel was sloshing in the gauges. But I've flown a simulator out at Ames Research Center quite a bit in the past, in which they had a simulation of fuel slosh. And believe me, you notice it when you're trying to land the spacecraft. So putting those baffles in was important. Is what the folks here were doing, and in their back rooms, every console there had a back room of more people. They were monitoring the telemetry. That's something we couldn't do, and still fly the spacecraft. And so you're depending on them, like you heard the fuel call outs and things like that, for somebody to be watching over your shoulder on those kinds of issues while you actually try to do the flying. And that's what Neil was doing during that period. Obviously, you didn't notice he getting very excited. Neil never seemed to get excited about anything. He was a perfect person to be the first pilot to land on the moon, no question about that. And so my feeling was that I just left all that, almost all of that monitoring to this room and the people in it. It doesn't mean that I wasn't scanning the dials at the same time, but our information was much more granular than what they had down here, and I knew that. The same was going on during launch, as we talked, is that they were watching that kind of telemetry. I couldn't because of the vibration, at least not initially. Now, you heard very briefly the mention of the AGS. That's the Abort Guidance System. It's a separate computer, all intents and purposes, independent of the primary guidance and navigation system, the PINGs. With one exception, on Apollo 17, And I was responsible for this backup computer. That was one of my many jobs, was to make sure that it was up to date, monitoring what was going on. It was not as precise as the other, but it was good. It was what we needed in order to abort and actually rendezvous. It was all built into that AGS. But on the other hand, I worked with I think it was CRW people that were the manufacturers, designers and manufacturers of the AGS. And I said, isn't there some way in which that we can put get an altitude update, independent altitude update out of the AGS? And we worked on that for a while and found that there was. That at about 30,000 feet precisely, if the radar was giving the primary guidance system good radar information, good altitude information, I could enter that into the abort guidance computer. And it would have, although it was tied, that altitude was tied to the radar and to the other computer, at the moment, once that was in there, it was independent. And it was monitoring our altitude. And one reason I wanted to do that was that I had always had the feeling that commanders, no matter what, they were going to land on the moon. And if we lost radar, altitude information from the primary system, then we would have an independent altitude so I could land them on the moon. My job was to give the commander the information that with the computer, the primary computer and the AGS were providing about our position in space and the relative velocities. And you heard Buzz Aldrin giving some generalized information to Neil. I was a little more precise in terms of what was the velocity left or right and up and down. He was giving up and down velocities, but not left and right. That was all intentional so that the commander didn't have to look inside the spacecraft. That's not good. If you're focused on something outside and you have to look down here to see the stuff on the computer, it takes you a while to refocus on the outside. And so the lunar module pilot was primarily helping to fly the spacecraft by giving the information that the computer had and the guidance system had on what relative velocities were and altitude. The perception of risk by the people doing it is much lower. And I think that one of the reasons, that disconnect was one of the reasons why we canceled 3 Apollo missions, as I think maybe I said earlier. It was a disconnect between the confidence that people in this room had and the astronauts had versus what management had. And management was sitting there worried about losing somebody, and we never worried about that. Until it happened, like Apollo 13. Then we worried about it and brought them back. Another function of the lunar module pilot had to do with one very relatively remote risk, and that was that in going into lunar orbit, you didn't get a full burn. And there were certain situations where you had to use the lunar module and activate the lunar module and use its engines in order to get back on a free return trajectory to the Earth, okay? And that meant that your center of gravity was different. And controlling, from the lunar module, controlling an offset center of gravity was really a challenge. And it meant that the commander would fly one set of needles and I would fly the other set of needles, and in order to maintain that burn so that it was going through the center of gravity. Those were exciting simulations, believe me. And Sim Soup, who lived right over there, was diabolical. If there ever was a definition of somebody who was an assistant of the devil, it was a simulation supervisor. I worked with him a little bit. In fact, we did a simulation for Apollo 11, and I was back there working with him. And we had the crew outside the spacecraft, and the Sim Soup and his guys started to fail systems in the lunar module, and it started to get more and more dicey about whether we could complete the EVA. And finally, Kranz, who was the director on the sim, said, "Get them back in." And the then director of JSC Science says, "Well, what about the rock box?" And Kranz turned around and looked at him and said, "Blank, blank, blank, the rock box." And get them in. I tell you, these simulations had everybody as uptight as a real mission. It was really quite impressive. That's one of the things that impressed me most, with how these young men, mostly, could get so deeply involved in what they were doing. Yes. All my time down there operating, running those procedures with the simulator people. And as a matter of fact, we were developing, thinking all the time about procedures that they might need, and sending those inputs back. The simulator fellows at LMS2 were very imaginative, and they're the ones that figured out how to use the Earth as a reference in order to get a rough realignment of the guidance computer in the LEM. And that's what eventually we ran those. I helped them run those simulations down there, but it was their idea. They came up with it, and then we sent that back up here, and it was put into the procedures. So it was an exciting time, no question about it. Nobody got much sleep, that's for sure.
9 points of contact.
And I was responsible there for, if we had to overcheck, for just operating this. All I had to do was pull the handle, and the whole thing, nitrogen bottle,
Blew off.
Now, I slept underneath the couch whenever I went during the respirator. We alternated the conduit between Cerner and myself. Because Ron Evans couldn't wake him up.
Really?
So,
You need to sleep in?
yeah.
No kidding.
When he was a pilot. Oh, cool.
Wow.
Combat pilot.
I'm surprised they didn't wash him out.
I don't think they do it. But from where my head was, I could see the cautionary warning pen.
Yeah.
And I'd wake up about every 2 hours and check the cameras, listen to the fans, and make sure. Well, first respirator issue, they hadn't been able to wake me up, so they activated the warning system.
Right.
And so when I woke up, I saw this red light on, and so I reached up to punch off the light, which was a normal reaction, so it could come on again or something happened. Well, it was hot.
Oh.
So it's been on for quite a while.
That's a lot
no,
better, right?
No, we had some all the way to the I don't know. I guess.
Well, you can see the halogens that are mounted on little rails that are suspended from the interior to be able to light all this stuff up in this low light environment. But wasn't the sunlight a really harsh, overlit and dark as tomb contrast?
See that in the picture. It's hard to take a picture.
Right.
So when you went down on the dark side, did you see anything on the dark side?
You could a little bit I'd done a lot of equipment development. At one time, had gone through 80 parameters. We held Jack Small and I held a record for equipment for a long time, but ultimately that record was broken in the KC 135.
I thought that was a VC 135.
35. I don't
Yeah,
know what
135. Yeah.
I always call
you guys had a VC 135. That was for your ups and downs.
Could be. I never
Yeah,
heard
yeah.
it referred
But
to.
it was modified from a KC 135.
That's all we ever
Yeah,
called it.
yeah. But you didn't have any fuel or tail boom or anything. You have the full padded interior and all the additional windows and all that.
Yeah. No, it was
Nice.
No, it was a great development tool. But one of the more interesting psychological things that I experienced was that when I was doing tool development, I had absolutely no problem physically with parabolas. When I was in training for a mission, I couldn't go more than a couple parabolas before I'd throw up. Now, why was that?
Any idea?
I have no
You're
idea.
focused.
I think it had to do with focus.
Yeah, a mission.
It just different. I was using a different set of nervous system, I guess.
Well,
But no, it really had maybe a lot more on my mind or something. I don't know. It was just really an interesting thing. You would hit a peak G of 7, and then that was to make sure you were captured. And then the computer would hold about 4 Gs as it guided itself to where it had been told the carrier was. Now the carrier wasn't really there. It was about 5 nautical miles away, because one thing they didn't want to do is have a carrier landing. So
first arresting,
and we had a better guidance system than the carrier did anyway. One of the great stories, which may or may not be true, because I have not been able to verify it, even with crayons, is that early in the Gemini program, one of the great characters of space named John Llewellyn, a great Welsh name, a former Marine, he came out of the Chosen Reservoir thing and everything like that. He was responsible for guidance systems, and particularly for landing, knowing where were they going to land. But he found out that the carriers didn't know really where they were, but that the nuclear submarines did. And so he, on his own, asked the Navy to park a nuclear submarine under the carrier, so they'd had the same guidance as the Apollo people did. And the first crayons heard about it was when the Navy sent a bill for a submarine on deployment. Now, whether that's a true story or not, I don't know, but it's a typical John Llewellyn action. Actually, he's the guy that kept parking his car in the administrator's slot at Mission Control Center. So they banned him from driving on his car into the Mission Control, so he rode his horse and grazed it out there. On that, continually I was doing that, but I didn't stop what I was doing.
Oh yeah, but you were seeing the
$1 million
surroundings.
a man minute.
Yeah, $1 million a man minute. Yeah.
And that was in those days. That's not with inflation.
$1 million was worth something.
Any other questions? We're a little bit higher. Yeah. See, the Earth is always at 0, 0, plus or minus.
So the core equipment they're showing there is not too different from what we were using at the time to do core samples, in regular field work, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, were
Yeah,
there
these are actually derived. Mainly thermal, battery power.
So your battery power, and battery power was powerful enough to cut through the rock?
Yeah, most of what you're going through though is just pulverized rock.
Right.
Every once in a while you get down to that. But the distribution is probably good. We don't give you the next number.
I think we need to put the
Particular sample, I think, has about
so it's 1210, yes, so 1210. I was thinking it just we can send somebody back.
translate for
Yeah.
12 is a little more titanium. Yeah, I collected that here because it's off of a great big. You may see a picture of me talking to Ivanka Trump. My hands like this. Well, when Trump signed that directive, NASA brought a sample over in a big chunk of lucite that was about this big.